Hi, I'm Cal Lee from the School of Information and Library Science at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I appreciate this chance to share with you some of my ideas about a somewhat different and I hope useful way to think about some of the problems of digital curation. So, what I'd like to suggest is that we think about digital curation in terms of some core dualities. And by dualities, I'm talking an opposition that's not simply a contradiction or a dichotomy, but a sort of split in the paths of ways that we can potentially approach a problem, even though we can often pursue them in complementary ways. Human processes involve dynamic interplay between alternatives, paths, or perspectives. From William Blake, we have without contrary is no progression. So, two examples of dualism in digital curation that I wanted to talk about a little bit are custodial versus non-custodial and emulation versus migration. So by a dualism, I'm contrasting dualities in the sense of making a very clear dichotomous relationship between two options. So we've had a discussion over a number of decades now about the role of custodian in the digital curation activities. What is the role of taking records and putting them or other materials into a particular storage location that's distinct from the creation environment? Frank Upward, contributing to this discussion, ultimately concludes post-custodial approaches to archives and records cannot be understood if they're treated as a dualism. They are not the opposite of custody. And I think what we've really learned from this discussion over the years is that the right approach to digital curation doesn't simply ask this question of do the materials move from one place to another or not? They ask much more um, thoughtful questions about the types of functions and roles that we need to engage in at different places in the life of the digital materials. Similarly, we had a debate back in the late 1990s, carrying through certainly into the 2000s, about emulation versus migration. And you have these two positions, one from Jeff Rothenberg being that the best way to satisfy the criteria for a digital preservation solution is to run the original software under emulation on future computers. And he made a very clear and eloquent, though obviously debatable, argument for emulation as the right approach for digital preservation. We should imitate the original computers so that we can run them on whatever existing future platform we need to run them on. David Bierman then making the argument Rothenberg is fundamentally trying to preserve the wrong things by preserving information system functionality rather than records. This perspective being that what we really need to represent are things like the metadata and contextual information associated with the materials, as opposed to a capture of the environment that they were sitting in at the time. The reality, I would say, from my perspective over the years of following this literature and being part of the professional conversations, is that we've really found a way to approach this problem as a duality. There are different perspectives and different orientations we can take toward the preservation of materials, but they can actually complement each other in a number of ways given different scenarios and different tasks that we're trying to perform with the materials. So if we think in dualities, there are a number of different dualities I've been trying to articulate. Three of them that I just want to talk about quite briefly are just in case versus just in time, uh, chronic, synchronic, snapshot approach, with the other side being a diachronic or a diffs approach, and internal and external complexity of digital materials and digital objects. So if we think of just in case and just in time, we can do all kinds of pre-processing in anticipation of specific access paths. For example, we can do OCR, indexing, text extraction, natural language processing, things like extracting names of entities or topic modeling and filtering and redaction, identifying materials that might need to be restricted from access and marking them and potentially even removing them in various ways from the content. All of those things we can do in anticipation of a potential specific access path. We can alternatively do all those things at the point that they are requested. We can retain enumerated values as a sequence of ones and zeros stored somewhere, or we can retain the ability to generate those enumerated values if and when necessary. We can store values locally through things like caching and buffering and prefetching and hash tables, all of which computer scientists and electrical engineers have been using for quite some time, and getting values on demand when they're needed. So, for example, I could store the value of um, a variable locally because I know I'm going to need it immediately, as opposed to holding on to the ability to define that value later on in the calculation process, which is a label we often use as early binding and late binding. Another distinction we can make is between snapshots and diffs. So we can do a full backup. We can create a complete snapshot of the state of information at a particular point in time. Alternatively, we can approach things as incremental and diff-based reflection of changes over time. So one contrast we can find of this is a full page capture in the Internet Archive, where you can go into the Wayback Machine and find snapshots of pages from particular points in time. With the alternative being looking at the track changes in Wikipedia or in Google Docs, where you can roll through backward or forward in time through revisions and changes. Those are not made by creating a full snapshot of the page every time it changes, but instead taking diffs or incremental changes that can be used to then recombine and reconstruct the document or the artifact at a particular point in time. We can also think about internal and external complexity. So, from a philosophical perspective, this would be looking at, for example, internal relations as Leibniz talked about them. Leibniz having this notion of a monad, which was a self contained entity that essentially reflected the entire universe around it. If we took one of these incredibly tiny particles, we could find a reflection of everything around it because it was like a mirror from all of its relations contained within itself. Whereas from the perspective of Newton, we have much more of this notion of the relations are actually something external to the object that we then use to relate objects to each other as opposed to instantiating within the objects themselves. We can look at intelligence in the network, and we can look at intelligence in the nodes. So, for example, the way the internet has developed, the way local networks are developed, do we embed a lot of complexity into each of the nodes so that they're relatively easy to connect and can be tightly coupled with each other, but involve a lot of internal complexity, versus pushing most of the complexity into the protocols that are supported by the network and having each node be relatively simple and easy to swap in and out. Similarly, we can push a lot of metadata into an object so that the object carries that metadata with it. Alternatively, we can push that metadata into supporting systems and platforms that they can be referenced if and when they're necessary. And as you can see from that basic characterization, the just-in-time versus just-in-case duality and the internal complexity and the external complexity duality have various overlaps when we look at particular cases as well. And as I'll be concluding here, I believe that's actually an asset to this approach rather than a liability. So what are some of the potential advantages of framing digital curation in terms of dualities? One is that we consciously avoid false dichotomies. We don't say it has to be one path or the other, and once we've decided one, we've decided definitively from here into the future. It also is the means to provide explicit rationales for entire strategic or technical decisions rather than having everything come down to very overwhelming atomistic actions, as if every small decision we make from a digital curation perspective has to be seen in and of itself, as opposed to realizing that we're taking these general broad orientations that can be carried from one task to another. As heuristics for decision making, there's no insistence on identifying dualities as being mutually exclusive and exhaustive. I'm not trying to propose an ontology here. I'm trying to propose rules of thumb for making decisions. They can be applicable across levels of granularity, so we can be making these decisions about things like bit streams embedded into files, or much higher level decisions about copies um, of system files and software and supporting libraries across entire infrastructures. And then finally, we can hopefully complement existing and emerging efforts to conceptualize digital materials and their curation. This is not a contrast to formal reference models or other frameworks for thinking about digital curation. It's intended as a set of heuristics that will help us make decisions when we're cutting across a lot of those low-level considerations. Thank you for your time, and I would love to hear your thoughts on some of these nascent ideas about the dualities of digital curation. Thank you.